And presenter, Marcy Smothers. Hello.
Hi everybody, thank you for being here. I am going to share with you, the book was published in September of 17, and how lucky am I to be here with all of you at Walt Disney World. And we all raise our right hand, and for here on in promise to please call it always Walt Disney World. It was called Disney World when Walt was planning it, and 2 days after he passed away on December 17th, 1966, Roy said, I'm going to put my brother's first name and it's always going to be Walt Disney World. And I'm so pleased to always call it Walt Disney World. Also, I will be at the Art of Disney at 1 o'clock following this, signing books. Apparently they don't have them here, but they have a lot of them there, and I hope to see some of you there. So let's start learning how to eat like Walt. So here we have Walt at home with his daughter Sharon having hamburgers. And when I was researching the book, why would there be a book about how Walt Disney ate? It's just the lens to talk about this great and magnificent man, because everybody eats and it's very intimate, and it's very everyday. But my original idea was that I wondered if Walt Disney had planned for the attractions at Disneyland to be immersive and the food at Disneyland to be immersive and entertaining like the attractions. And doing my research for the proposal, I found an insert in an Orange County newspaper, July 1955, where Walt said, "Welcome to the kingdom of good eating, where the food's is fabulous and fun. Like Adventureland and Fantasyland, dining at Disneyland is an attraction unto itself." So I knew I had a book about the culinary history of Disneyland. What I didn't know when I sold the book, that there was going to be these two other chapters, Walt at Home and Walt at the Studio. The Walt at Home is probably one of my favorites because the Walt Disney's family spoke with me at length. And they are very, very, very private people. So I learned a lot of things that I'll share with you today. And some of them are in the book and some of them are not. And I also had, when I was doing my research in the archives at the Burbank studio, which is as fabulous as you think it is, because you just make your wish list and then you show up at a desk like this and the archivist put these boxes like Christmas and you open them and you're holding oftentimes, of course I'd cry, memos that were to Walt that he held, and he had his famous OK Walt on them. But what I learned about the studio, we'll go on to in a couple slides from now. So here's Walt having one of his favorite food, hamburgers. And I was so geeky that I zoomed in multiple times to see, was there mustard and ketchup and mayonnaise, cheese, no cheese? And I'd ask the family, and Walt was a very simple eater. And hamburgers were one of his favorite foods. Now here is the soda fountain that was at the Walt Disney home with Diane and Sharon, his daughters. Walt loved to hang out with his girls there. And Bob Gurr, Imagineer Bob Gurr, who did the monorail and the Utopia and all Walt's vehicles, of course, told me that whenever there would be parties and Walt would be there with friends, he would purposely make these horrible concoctions that nobody would want. Different ice creams mixed up, and he knew nobody would say no to Walt Disney. So he'd say, "Here, try this." That's okay, Walt, And it was Bob Gurr that also shared the story with me that when they went to Westinghouse to pitch for the World's Fair, they were served lobster salad in the executive dining room. And as soon as they got out of that meeting, Walt turned to his crew and said, "That was a horrible lunch. Let's go get some cheeseburgers and milkshakes." Here is something that I'm really thrilled to share with all of you. This is Foo-Foo, Thelma Pearl Howard. Thelma was Walt's housekeeper and cook for most of his adult life once he moved to Holtley Hills, and she stayed with the family years and years after Walt passed away. Walt referred to Thelma as his Mary Poppins. And even though they had a pretty big house, not a giant house, she did everything, all the cleaning, washing herself, and made all the food from scratch every night. Beautiful, beautiful cook. And again, Walt referred to her as his Mary Poppins. One of the things that the granddaughters told me is that she made the best deviled eggs. And whenever she would sprinkle paprika, however you want to pronounce it, she would call it pixie dust. So now whenever you're eating like Walt and you make some of these recipes, you'd say to your friends, "This is Foo-Foo's pixie dust." She was so beloved in the family that this was long after passed away. Like in the late 80s, Diane Disney Miller had noticed that she wasn't getting the Christmas cards from Thelma, and she got worried. So she found her in a nursing home sharing a ward with men and women. It was very shabby. Diane moved her to the motion picture home in Calabasas with a garden view, paid for everything, sent her flowers every single week, and visited her all the time. When Foo-Foo passed away in 1994, she was worth $9 million. And that's because Walt gave her stock every Christmas and every birthday, but she felt that it was disloyal to her boss to use it, so she just saved it except for taking care of her developmentally disabled fund. And after she passed away, the Disney family, Disney Miller family, established a foundation in her name, the Thelma Pearl Howard Foundation. Now, since Thelma was a really good cook, and he got tired of Lillian's repeat meals, I mean, most of us have repeat meals. They say that everybody has just 10 meals that they make over and over again. He's made her a list of his favorite foods. And here it is. There's actually 2 pages. I have both pages in the book. Walt Disney's favorites, you can see at the top. You can see his signature loopy handwriting, Spam and eggs with biscuit and honey. Pretty simple food. He liked roast foods, roast potatoes, and I love at the bottom, only 1 vegetable. Now, if I were the boss of Disneyland, which I say with affection, I would have a Walt's restaurant. And on the menu for Walt's restaurant, it would say only 1 vegetable. So no matter how much you want, you could only get 1 vegetable like Walt. Now, this is a great story. These are called Chinese candy cookies, and they were in the Walt Disney home long after Walt passed away, and they were one of Walt's favorite cookies. Until my book that had never been published before. And the only reason I knew how to find it, how I found it, was that I knew that after Walt passed away, Lillian married Mr. John Truyans. And so in this obscure cookbook, it's not completely unknown. Some geeky collectors know it. It's called 5-Star Favorites. It's the Eisenhower Hospital in the Palm Desert area of California, had famous people contributing recipes. And Mrs. John Truyans contributed Chris's cold pie, which is fairly ubiquitous. It's in my book, but it's on D23. They serve it in a lot of restaurants here. And Chris actually was the first grandson of Walt and Lillian Disney, and he gave Fufu her nickname because he couldn't pronounce Thelma, so it became Fufu. But the other recipe that was in the book were these Chinese candy cookies. And so, I am a research geek. I started Googling Walt Disney butterscotch cookies, haystack cookies, chow mein noodles. There's only 3 ingredients: butterscotch chips, chow mein noodles, and dry roasted peanuts. And the recipes are free on eatlikeWalt.com, so you can make these. Definitely, I knew it had never been published. It was unknown. So when I met with Ron Miller, Diane's husband, Diane had passed away by then, and 2 of his granddaughters, I made these cookies. And Jenny started crying. "You made my grandpa's cookies." And I knew then I had found something, because she was crying. She's the one that told me Fufu kept him in wax paper in the cookie jar in the Disney family home years after Walt had passed away. And I knew, this is really cool. This is something that Walt Disney loved, that was in his cookie jar, that we can make if we want to eat like Walt. Coffee, very, very important to Walt. I actually could do a chapter on Walt Disney and coffee. And when you write a book, you start with the words and you're researching it. Then you start looking for the images, which was also really fun because I got to go to the Walt Disney Archives, the Walt Disney Photo Archives, the Walt Disney Research Library, the Walt Disney Imagineering Library, and the Walt Disney Art Imagineering Library. And looking at stuff, and I'm in a very specific time period because my book and my little niche in Disney history is I am a Walt Disney historian. Something to do with the Haunted Mansion to 19. It comes so late in the book that I can only put it in a caption, but I love it. So here is Walt having custard with, these are men from the Royal Air Force, excuse me. When Walt was at the end of World War I in the ambulance corps in France, he found some powdered milk and powdered eggs. And he made himself custard, and he was so proud of that custard, and he put it on the windowsill to cool, went for a walk. When he came back, all the British flyers were eating his custard. And then he becomes Walt Disney. And so they made a big deal of coming and repaying the debt and bring Walt Disney custard in the office 26 years later after that had happened. Now here is Flora and Elias. And I'm honored to say that my friend Kay Mallins is here. Kay, would you stand up? She's one of the founders of the Walt Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline. And I don't know, who's been to Marceline? Who knows what Marceline is? Okay, so Marceline was Walt's hometown. He didn't live there very long, but it was the most formative time of his life. And they have an amazing museum in Marceline, totally worth a visit to Missouri. It was, Kay gave up her bedroom for Walt and Lillian to sleep in, so there's something to say there. But anyway, when I was at the museum and at the gala for the Walt Disney Hometown Museum with my friends Shirley and Albert Schmidt, also here, this summer, I learned something about Walt that didn't make it to the book, but is probably one of my favorite stories revolving around food. So when Walt was in Marceline, his dad bought land, wasn't necessarily the best farmer or businessman. His mom, Flora, made really great, creamy, delicious butter. They had plenty of milk, she made the butter. And Roy and Walt would go into town and they would sell the butter. Well, Elias, being tight, said, the family is not going to eat this butter. We are going to sell every single ounce of Flora's butter. No butter for the family. However, Flora, being a mom, used to butter the bottom sides of the kids' bread and pass it to him like this. And you could hear Walt in the museum. There's an exhibit where he says, and here we are all loaded up with butter, and Dad doesn't know, and he's just cracking up. So if you want to eat like Walt, one of the really, really authentic things you could do is tell your friends this story and only butter the bottom of the bread. So here's Walt's office, one of the views. He had two offices, a working office and a formal office, and that is the Coast Guard bill. That was an award that Walt was given. Well, one day when Walt was getting very chatty, and there's a distinction here from his secretary, Tommy. She says he was in a good mood, and he was running late, and lunchtime was 12:30, so she just went up there and gave the bell a ring right in front of Walt. And he was startled, and he looked at her, and she said, it's lunchtime, Walt. And he goes, oh, okay. Looks at his watch. They go off to the commissary, which, by the way, at the Walt Disney Studio, when it opened in 1940, Walt was only 39 years old. He'd never had any commissaries at the previous Kingswell or Hyperion or Laugh Gram. They went off the lot to eat. He had 4 state-of-the-art restaurants at the Disney Studios, and also he subsidized everything so people could afford a good, healthy, hot meal, which now we think about happening in Silicon Valley with Google and Pixar and all that, Facebook, but he was doing it in 1940. He also waited in line and paid for his food at Disneyland and at the studio. It wasn't until 1955 that Walt had his private dining room, or the executive dining room, the Coral Room. He waited that long, 15 years of waiting in line. It just became evident. People were saying, Walt, we need you to be more efficient. We've got to have a private executive dining room. But that took a long time because he was a humble man. And when you talk to the people that work with Walt, and one of the distinctions I like to say with my book, Eat Like Walt, The Wonderful World of Disney Food, is everybody knew Walt, no exceptions. There's no third person. There's no my mom told me. My brother used to work with Roy. It is everybody knew Walt, and I think that is very important. So anyway, when he loved his lunch, and he loved his chili, and when he would go to the commissary, he would always put saltines in his pockets, spare saltines in case they ran out. And Lillian used to get very upset. She said, Walt has the most beautiful clothes, because he was a snappy dresser, but whenever I have to go to the dry cleaners, he would dump out all the saltine crumbs out of his pockets, So it's just another of many examples of how Walt was an everyday man. The last story before I get to this one about the studio is that there was a waitress at the Coral Room, and Cecile, and she had only worked there about 6 months when she got in a horrific car wreck in Las Vegas. Walt found out about it. He sent his plane to pick her up and her husband. She was rendered a quadriplegic, and at that time, that was a terrible diagnosis in the mid-60s. He set her up at Van Nuys Presbyterian Hospital because that's where her kids lived. He sent Christmas presents to the kids. When she got out of the hospital 6 months later, he sent her to Rancho Alamitos for rehab, paid for that for a year, and then he moved her back home. And he gave her a silver pass. Anytime she wanted to go, in only 6 months of working, you don't get silver passes in 6 months. Anytime that she wanted to go to Disneyland, her family, he took good care of her, and they honored that long after Walt had passed away. So you see all these stories are around food, but it tells you who Walt is. And that's what kind of how, when people say, what's there to, Walt ate hamburgers, what's there to, and Spam, what's there to learn? All these stories. And how much he loved that bell ringing at 12:30. And so from that point forward, if he had guests in his office and the secretaries didn't come in and ring the bell at 12:30, he'd be pressing on his intercom. He didn't want to ring the bell himself. He liked the show of the secretaries doing that. And they knew, time to see Walt. So now, how to eat and entertain like Walt. There are about 40 recipes in the book. They're all vintage and authentic to Walt Disney's era, either at home, at the studio, or at Disneyland. So there's nothing that goes past that era with Walt. One of the things when I was talking with the family, I also do radio and TV show hosting. So I said, I'm sorry if I'm asking you a question that everybody asks you, but I feel obliged. And they said, sure, what is it? What happens when you open Walt Disney's refrigerator? What did you see? And they said, no one's ever asked us. And they just start talking about it. Everything had a story. The cold hot dogs, which people know about, et cetera, et cetera. The sodas, exactly, Strawberry Crush, Orange Crush, Dr. Pepper, and Coke, which is interesting because at Disneyland, both Coke and Pepsi sponsored attractions, Coca-Cola Refreshment Corner, which in Marceline, clear as day, the Zurcher building, it's got the same corner like this. It's right next to it has Coca-Cola on the side of the building, and it also shares a funeral parlor, or did back in the day. And I hope I've got the story right, Kay, that when they were living in Marceline and Roy would sweep up the floors in the funeral parlor and there were all the hearses and the stuff back there, Walt would go with his big brother to work and he'd lay in the back of the hearse and say, I'm dead, Roy, dead, 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 look at me, dead, I'm dead. And, you know, all these sweet things, like the look at the Coca-Cola Refreshment Center that is in Marceline, one of the influences Main Street USA, not the only influence, of course, Harper Golf in Fort Collins had a lot of influence as well, was that you think that was at the beginning because Walt liked to scare people. He would be very young, he'd be 9 or 10 when that happened. You flash forward to 1989 when the Haunted Mansion opened and you could see how the wheels were turning. And again, if you get to go to Marceline, you'll learn a lot about what influenced Walt there. So the other thing that they said, what was in the refrigerator that I found fascinating, was Foo always had a relish tray on crushed ice 24 hours a day. It did not matter when Walt got home. Walt loved his crudité, and I didn't realize that, even though he doesn't like vegetables, he liked the crunchy raw stuff. And after that, when I spoke with Marty Sklar, the Imagineering legend and Disney legend, he said, yeah, you know what, Marcy, now that you say it, most times when we'd be at the studio, they would just automatically bring us a relish tray. But so now you get to, I'm a geek. Okay, I'm the biggest Disney geek Walt fan ever. So I'm like, I just can't say in the book there's a relish tray. So I start emailing the granddaughters. Carrots, coins or sticks, radishes, whole, half, cut, sliced, celery, how fat, skinny, could they cut the celery into 3 pieces, 2 pieces? And when they appeared with me on stage at D23, along with Jim Cora, who is a Disney legend. He has a window here at Walt Disney World and all the parks in Europe, and of course Disneyland. And they said to me for the first time, you were so annoying, you know? But I'm like, but if you want to eat like Walt, you have to have a relish tray exactly like Walt. So I have the exact dimensions of the vegetables in the book. And then one of my first reviews was from Log Cabin Pat, and she gave me a 1. And what she said was, like, I need to know how to make a relish tray. Well, clearly she did. She wasn't a Walt Disney person. She cracked me up. But I think if you want to eat like Walt, it's really, really important to replicate what you would have seen if you've opened the Disney refrigerator. The other thing you can have, so you start with crudité, always. And before we get to drinks, if you're going to have lunch, what time are you serving lunch? 12:30. Yep, and you're got to get a bell because you're going to be more on point with the way that Walt Disney ate than probably and for sure any of your friends. You get bonus points. The other thing that Walt really liked to have before dinner was Triscuits or crackers with salami, yellow cheese, and black olives. So that would be another great appetizer. Deviled eggs with paprika, pixie dust. Now we get into the adult snow cones. That's what I call Scotch mists. They're adult snow cones. They're crushed ice with Scotch. Walt did have his adult snow cones at the studio, and he'd have one before he would go, and then on Friday when he would bring the Sherman Brothers. And that story to me, I'm going to go briefly to Feed the Birds. It's talked about a lot. How many people know the story of Walt in his office with Feed the Birds? So that's what's important, is because I learned this from Marty Sklar. It's the same thing with Disneyland, Walt Disney World. It's for people going the first time or the 100th time. So a lot of stories, I'll have audiences and they know everything about this, but it's one of my favorite stories, so I'm going to share it. Walt in his office would have Scotch mist in the evening, and he would, at 5 o'clock was cocktail hour, and he would invite the Sherman Brothers on Fridays, and they would play, or Richard would play Feed the Bird. Richard would play Feed the Birds for him, and he would always look out the window, and people would report differently, but I went and looked at what Robert said, and he would mess up, and when you hear the lyrics of Feed the Bird, it says, show them you care. And Walt would turn around at the end of the song and say, yep, that's it, that's what life's about, isn't it, guys? And what he meant from that is that the greatest gift in life is to be able to help and share with others. And that is our Walt Disney. But back to food and Scotch mists and adult snow cones. I also learned that when he was at home, he would have long spoons in the Scotch mists, and he'd put some oranges kind of on top because he will work too. Non-alcoholic drinks, Coke, not Pepsi, was his favorite. I know that because I got the list of what was in Walt Disney's apartment every time he came to Disneyland. Very excited about that. To Walt Disney, here's what will be stocked. And I put everything in the content. There's only a few things they didn't let me put in the book, and that was one of them, the actual menu memo. But that's when I learned Walt was a Coke guy, not Pepsi, even though Pepsi had the Golden Horseshoe. By the way, it always has the Golden Horseshoe in it. He also liked V8 juice, and he served V8 juice in the office all the time, too. He drank his warm, but he had cold for the guests. So you need to serve some V8 juice. You can decide if you want it warm or cold. If you're going to have chili, the recipe is on D23, has one of the chili recipes. I actually found a much older one. It's too long of a story here. I did a lot of research which one came first, but I think the other one in the book is the one from a cookbook called Kings in the Kitchen, interestingly. And that's because it has suet in it, which is a really old school, they were using that in the 30s and 40s, but that kind of fat gives chili a lot of flavor. The other thing when people tell me they don't think the chili on the Pitchell Park's version is very good when they make it at home, is my theory is that back in the day, ground beef had a lot of fat in it. It's like 60%, 40% fat, 40-60. Now people are using 90-10, 80-20, and that's not as tasty. But if you want to do a chili appetizer, what are you going to serve with it? Saltines, nothing else. I have to say at the Walt Disney Family Museum, and I'm a founding member, at their feeding operation, they serve it with a baguette. And I keep saying to the family, oh, no, we have to fix this. We have to get this right. Waldorf salad, you can look at the menus, the list that he wrote for Fufu to see the different types of salads. He also liked cucumbers, tomatoes, and to dip them in vinegar. And his wedge salad with blue cheese. Roast meat, of course, with roasted potatoes. How many vegetables? Right, and when I asked the family, what did he like, he puts on the list that he liked like canned peas, which, by the way, a lot of canned food, but you gotta remember in mid-century America, canned foods were a novelty and really quite good. So that's why I think that, he had that there. But so Fufu apparently made the green beans with Tamara, one of the granddaughters who was always with Fufu in the kitchen. That was Walt's favorite. So I recreated, and that recipe doesn't exist because Fufu's gone. I worked with Tamara and recreated Fufu-style green beans, which you're going to love because basically it's bacon and onions and green beans. So you can't go wrong with that. Dessert, Chinese candy cookies. I found some recipes in the archives never before published from Walt's home. There's a marshmallow pudding. There's a soft gingerbread, and he always liked his apple pie with melted cheddar cheese on top. So if you do that, have that. So we're going to take some questions. That is the basis of my presentation. However, I'm asked all the time, and I didn't know when I was able to tell people about the next book. And so here is the next book. The idea is, when I sent this to the president of Imagineering, I spoke at Imagineering 3 times. Now, that's another thing that makes me be very, very, very geeky. And I sat with Bob Weiss for an hour. My mission is to keep Walt Disney in Disneyland. And by the way, at Disneyland, it's Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. I always say that it's the only attraction with Walt's name on it. He actually owned it. He paid for everything, and then he sold it back to Disneyland the day that it opened. And that's why there was a charge for the tickets at Disneyland above your entrance fee. Here, we have the same thing, Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress. It's the only attraction with Walt Disney's name on it. Just like Walt Disney World, I am emphatic. But since I am a Disneyland historian, what we're going to do is you're going to have a chance to walk like Walt and go through the park exactly like Walt did with his notebook. I bet you're walking past stuff that had Walt's imprint on it you never knew. Again, to speak to the Feed the Bird story, a lot of people don't know that that's Walt's apartment. Basic things like that. Kids, I know how Walt entered the park exactly the way. That's how geeky I am. Where he parked, how he entered, how he crossed across to Disneyland. And you will go around Disneyland with this guidebook, and every story will be told through Walt's point of view about the attractions. Something that has never been told about Pirates of the Caribbean that was Walt Disney's ideas things like that. One really cool story that's tangential, but I think relates to how much people love Walt Disney when they work for him. Bill Evans was the landscape designer, and when they were remodeling Tomorrowland, there was this regalata palm, which is this palm with multi-trunks. It was the biggest one in California, and he kept saying, Walt, it's terrific, we got to get it for Tomorrowland. But Walt was busy, yeah, for a couple of years, we'll do it one day, sure, Bill, just remind me. And then he passed away suddenly in December 1966. So a week later, Bill Evans drove to Santa Barbara, 1966, spent $3,000 of his own money in 1966, trucked the tree to Tomorrowland, called Imagineer Rolly Crumb, and they planted it in honor of Walt Disney, and it's still there. So my book will show you what Walt Disney learned through Walt's eyes. And after this, of course, I will be at Disney Springs. There's all my social media if you want to follow me, and I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening for a whole half hour. Does anybody have any questions? You don't have to be shy. I love to answer questions. Shirley. Here's a microphone for you.
On the snow cones, you had oranges. Were they sliced, cubed?
Very good question. Thinly sliced and from the garden, from the orchard, the orange orchard in Walt Disney's backyard. Yes, very good question. Anybody else? There's one there, thank you.
I'm Denise.
Hi, Denise. Oh, hi, Denise. And mouse steps.
Yeah.
Does everybody know mouse steps?
Okay.
Are you following Denise? Because you need to. She has got the best stuff. Oh, hi.
And everybody needs to get your book because it's a great history book and not just about food. Can you tell us how you got started being interested in food and Walt Disney?
Well, thank you for asking. Going to Disneyland, I grew up in Southern California, and going to Disneyland was always my favorite day of the year, and my grandparents would take me, modest means. I'd lay out my outfit. You know, we were allowed one treat. My grandfather would bring blankets and lay them out. He was a big reader, and he would mark a spot for us to see the Main Street Electrical Parade. So I've always loved Disneyland. And John Lasseter, who is one of my best friends who wrote the foreword for the book, he grew up going to Disneyland also. So we used to always be talking about what our favorite things about the park was. And I also have a full-scale miniature replica of Main Street USA, the Robert Olszewski collection, encased, and you can see that on my Facebook site. It's pretty amazing. I think or it's also on my Instagrams. Both Instagrams have that coffee table. It's like 3 times the big size of this. All Main Street USA. I don't collect a lot of Disneyland. But then I wanted to write, after I did a book, I did a radio show with Guy Fieri, and we did a show together for 2.5 years. And after that it led to a book deal with HarperCollins about food. But the next thing is I want to write the food of Disneyland, and my agent said, what are you going to do differently, you know, in the age of Instagram and, you know, and Twitter, and people are posting, which I think, by the way, Walt would love that idea of sharing his parks around the world instantaneously. I think he would, in my opinion, abhor those cell phones in the dark rides, and people are looking at their texts and lighting it up and not paying attention to the attraction. But so I had to figure out something, Denise, that would allow me to sell a book to Disney, and that's when I started researching and found The Kingdom of Good Eating, which was the original title, The Kingdom of Good Eating, and it was going to be the culinary history of Disneyland. And now, once I got to, you know, been doing this for a couple of years, I've now met with 7 living Disney legends, because everyone my book knew Walt, no exceptions. I was dressed with Rolly Crump. Rolly, of course, is from It's a Small World, famous for that. Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room and the Haunted Mansion, among many, many other things. And I now moved my space out of food to Disneyland in Walt Disney's era. And I may eventually get over here to Walt Disney World, because I am really curious about, by the time Walt had passed away, and all these men that I'm talking with were charged with taking Walt's dream and building this. How they did it. And I have some very interesting stories about that, why they did certain things the way, why Epcot is this and not what you saw on television, et cetera, et cetera. And then they started Imagineering food, and it was Marty that shared with me, Marty Sklar, that he vetoed the Mickey Mouse ice cream bar because he did not want guests biting off Mickey Mouse's ear, you know. And so it took a little bit of time to be able to override Marty Sklar and to have. So there's a lot happening here. I think the food at Walt Disney World is absolutely sensational. The theming is incredible, and we'll see if I migrate east one day. But I've another book after this one. It'll be a big coffee table book, major book. And that I will start writing after this book comes out in 2020. So thank you, Denise, and thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I think they're going to cut me off. Thank you, everybody. I'll stand over there if anybody has any questions or wants to take photographs, and I will be at Disney Springs at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much. Oh, Art of Disney. Thank you. Thank you. Why do I keep saying Disney Springs? I'll be at the Art of Disney at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Okay, guys.
Thank you for joining us here at